All right, folks, quick trigger warning here. There are a few violent and sexualized images in this presentation. Um, so for the earlier comics eras or ages that we've looked at, there's generally some agreement in terms of the time frame. The Dark Ages, however, is a little more difficult to pin down. While most scholars will attribute Crisis on Infinite Earths, from which was released from 1985 to 1986, and The Dark Knight Returns from 1986, and Watchmen from 1986 and 1987, with truly launching the Dark Ages. There's also a bit of an argument for the early 80s because Chris Claremont's Uncanny X-Men, specifically the Days of Future Past, had a lot of the same characteristics of these other comics. And in general, there are a lot of shared characteristics between the Bronze Age and the Dark Age. Some scholars refuse to use the Dark Age nomenclature at all, and instead prefer to call this era the Modern Age and suggest that it's still ongoing. But this ignores some pretty major developments that occurred in the early 2000s, which are very distinct from the iconic and popular Dark Age trends. And we will talk about those modern age trends from the 2000s when we get to that era. But for our purposes, for this class, we are going to go with this range of 1985 to the year 2000 as the Dark Age. Um, Before I get into what that specifically entails, we're going to recap the Bronze Age a little bit. Um, so remember that the Bronze Age runs from the early 70s into the mid 80s. Um, Probably the most iconic comics of this time are the Amazing Spider-Man numbers 96, 97, and 98, which were published in 1971. And this disrupted the comics, excuse me, Code Authority, which was again that kind of rating system that was put on comics to suggest that they were entirely um, appropriate for children. Um, this series of comics featured a lot of characteristics that had not typically been seen in comics, especially since the Comics Code Authority had been implemented. Um, the the US government asked Stan Lee to talk about the difficulties and dangers of drugs in a comic book as a way to reach people through its popularity. And so he did, and obviously there were no consequences because this was a self-imposed censorship or rating system. And so everyone kind of felt like the gloves were off, that they could kind of start telling any of the stories that they wanted to. Interestingly, even though this kind of broke the comics code in the 70s, it wasn't actually until 2011 that it was officially dismantled. The key characteristics of the Bronze Age, as a reminder, we had the return of horror stories, monsters, and adult content. We started seeing social commentary through like the references to the war on drugs, war itself, the war on drugs, and racism. We had diverse characters in the Silver Age, but in the Bronze Age, the minority and female characters became the leads of their own stories. We also had our first instances of superheroes being fallible. Spider-Man is unable to save Gwen Stacy from death, and characters can die. Gwen Stacy, a very famous and popular character, dies. And we see more and more of this happening in the Bronze Age, but really it's the Dark Age where these sorts of things kind of get taken up a notch. Um, so the Dark Ages is kind of more of the same from the Bronze Age. So all of those trends that were on that last slide continue to apply. But we do see some additional developments and they just sort of intensify. So the first thing that we start seeing a good deal more of is the concept of vigilantes. So vigilantes are characters that try to enforce the law without having any authority to do so. In the 1980s, the crime rate was one of the highest it had ever been in history, with a 61% increase in the national crime rate over 1963. Rape increased by 82%, homicide increased by 14%, and robbery increased by 44%. A poll in 1989 found that only 48% of people were actually confident that the police could protect them from violent crime. So more and more people began to argue that they should be allowed to defend themselves, and there were real life instances of vigilantism in America. There was the Magnificent 13 subway patrol, the Guardian Angels, and then famously, a man named Bernard Goetz shot four young black men who he claimed were going to mug him on a subway. Um, Kind of like some more recent instances of young black folks getting killed. Um, his actions caused a huge divide in the US. Bernard Gates, his actions, the killing of the young black guy, um, with many people supporting his vigilante actions, saying that he was justified since he was attacked, and others, on the other hand, saw his actions as being racially biased and considered it a hate crime. He was only found guilty of carrying an unlicensed firearm. Now, it should be noted that vigilantes and vigilante stories were not necessarily new. Just the kind of frequency and intensity of them became much more extreme. Um, so, well, Batman The Dark Knight Returns, Batman's obviously a vigilante, but in sort of the original Batman comics, he's kind of sanctioned by the police. There's the bat signal. He gets called in when there's a problem. Um, so it wasn't such a separation. Like in newer Batmans, he's very much outside of the law, and sometimes um, those folks who represent the law kind of sanction or not sanction him, kind of promote him or suggest that he stay outside the law because they can't get things done. Um, so Dark Knight Returns, other Dark Age comics, notably Alan Moore's V for Vendetta and Watchmen, all feature vigilante characters. And Frank Miller, who wrote The Dark Knight Returns, also wrote Sin City, and there are a lot of vigilantes in that story. And these two guys, Alan Moore and Frank Miller, were kind of the trendsetters in the Dark Age. Also, during this time, the US was embroiled in the Cold War with the Soviet Union and obviously other nuclear powers. Um, so one of the kind of trends we start to see is comics focusing on the concept of the nuclear, of possible nuclear war, the Cold War, and the anxiety associated with that. So Watchmen, and then two other iconic series that started arguably the Dark Ages all featured to some degree this threat of nuclear war. Watchmen, in that comic, the U.S. wins the Vietnam War or won the Vietnam War, and instead of relying on the threat of the bomb, the U.S. relies on this blue guy here, Dr. Manhattan, to dissuade enemies from starting nuclear war. And he's basically an atom bomb himself, and can disintegrate people and places on a whim. Um, in The Dark Knight Returns, Superman is dispatched to prevent a nuclear strike from the Soviets, and in Crisis on Infinite Earths, there's antimatter that threatens to destroy the entire universe. So they take the nuclear Cold War concept even like kind of further up a notch to a universe killer. Um, and what's kind of interesting is that all three of those comics, which are each one has an argument for this is the comic that started the Dark Age, features this particular trend. Um, in addition to the vigilantism and the nuclear Cold War anxiety, we just got in general what these kind of darker, edgier, grittier, more violent stories that feature anti-heroes. You're probably pretty familiar with The Punisher. He did have a Netflix adaptation show. And he is a person whose family gets murdered, and he goes out to enact revenge. The people who murdered his family are criminals. Um, and it's not just that he enacts revenge, it's that he enacts revenge violently. And the comic displays that violence visually instead of like kind of hiding the blood or like kind of turning away when like the murder happens. These images were put front and center in the story. Um, Sandman is another example of an anti-hero, definitely not a hero in the traditional sense. Dream is the sort of the main character. He is representative of um, kind of a concept rather than being an actual, like, he's not a human being. He's sort of a almost a god. Um, and because he's not human, his values and what he thinks are important are very different from ours, um, and sometimes antithetical to the things that we would expect of a hero. Sin City, a bit more of a traditional kind of anti-hero story. All of the characters, at least as best as I can remember, are criminals of some kind, and yet you root for them. And that's the nature of the anti-hero, right? You're rooting for a main character who does not behave in a traditionally heroic way. Um, Another very popular trend that happened during the Dark Ages was a preponderance of what we call misogynistic and over-sexualized portrayal of women or female characters. Um, there were obviously female characters in arguably skimpy fits in the Bronze and Silver and Gold Ages, um, but in the Dark Ages, um, they were they overemphasize particular body parts and engaged in what we call Baroque back poses. And the idea is that the poses that they were drawn in um, would, if you were to physically do that as a human being, it would literally break your body in some way. Um, so you can see kind of her positioning here. There is no way for a person to physically do that without severe physical injury. And also, she has muscles that have been drawn here that do not actually exist on a female human body. So there's just a lot of kind of like over exaggeration of particular features. Um, it, Interestingly, like at the in the early 2000s, sort of the transition between the Dark Age to the modern age, there was this movement called the Hawkeye Initiative, in which artists kind of all over the world drew Hawkeye in similar positions. Um, and to just kind of show how ridiculous it looked, and how it was accepted for female characters, but was made people kind of like uncomfortable to see on the male characters. Um, and it was one of these trends that happened that kind of pushed the envelope and allowed for female creators and female fans of comics to kind of reclaim their comic book fandom and push back against the kind of misogynistic male gaze that was popular at the time. Another trend at this time was something called bad girl narratives. Um, Sort of like the kind of anti-hero male stories. These were characters who either, like Lady Death, did not portray particularly kind of in heroic ways, or um, they were characters that for lack of a better term, female characters who were very badass. But because they were behaving more like male characters, they were fighting, they had superpowers, they were the ones doing the rescuing. Um, everyone around them kind of thought of them as being bad girls because they weren't being traditionally girly. So like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for example, in her series, um, she is an exceptional fighter. She has super strength. She's the one doing the rescuing all the time, saves everyone. But because of her job as the Slayer, which she has to keep secret, she has to break a lot of rules, and has gotten kicked out of several schools. Can't tell her mom what she does, so her mom thinks that she's a bad girl. Her principal thinks that she's a bad girl. So it was this idea that the only way for a woman to be heroic was to, one, be secretive, and two, to have to kind of like push against the bounds of society, and that that would not be acceptable by society. Um, and then finally, a trend of this time was what has now commonly become referred to as women in refrigerators. Um, So you'll see here in the picture, this is an image of one of the Green Lanterns, Kyle Rayner. And he discovers his girlfriend, Alexandra DeWitt, murdered by the supervillain Major Force. And Major Force has stuffed um, Alexandra, like kind of broken her body, folded her, and stuffed her into a refrigerator. And this is how Kyle finds her. And this is a moment in the narrative that launches um, his progress in the story, like her death. And her kind of violent end and this being shoved into the refrigerator sparks a rage in him so that he goes and fights the supervillain. Um, and so we see this trend kick up where the love interests of the superheroes start getting killed by the supervillains specifically to like get the hero to do something. Um, and this was really frustrating for female artists and writers at the time, and for female comic book fans, because these were the characters that women identified with, and um, killing them, maiming them, disempowering them really disconnects the audience and just kind of suggests to that audience that they don't have value. So Gail Simone, who was a artist, I forget, honestly, um, at the time created a website, a Women in Refrigerators website in 1999, where she like showed all of these different examples of this happening, and there were discussion boards and things like that about it. Um, and for Simone and a lot of the other female writers and comics artists, they were really concerned about this because of the direction the field was going and what it would do to a female readership. She had been quoted as saying, "If you kill the characters girls like, they won't read comics." And this is going to be important when we get to kind of the end of the Dark Age. Stay tuned for that. During this time, we also saw a rise in new publishers. So, while the kind of Bronze Age was Marvel's heyday, um, this is the kind of the rise of indie comics. So, Dark Horse Comics becomes a publishing imprint. It was created by a comic book store owner, Mike Richardson, um, and is known for featuring less traditional superheroes. He was willing um, to try anything content-wise, and a lot of the time they would even kind of poke fun at these dark age themes and like kind of make it a little bit ridiculous. Um, Valiant Comics started up in 1989. Jim Shooter and Steve Mazarsky attempted to buy Marvel, but they got turned down. Marvel maybe should have considered that when we get to that in a little bit. And they decided that they were going to start their own publishing company. And then finally, the probably other than Dark Horse, one of the more famous ones up here in 1992, Image Comics was started by Rob Liefeld. He was really concerned about copyright and financial compensation, plus creative freedom as a creator. At the time, when an artist worked for a publishing company, the company owned everything they did. So if there was like bad blood or the between the comic artist and the company, and the artist decided to leave, they could not take their work with them. And so, and they couldn't sell like copies of their work, not like necessarily issues, but like one of the things that happens at cons all the time is that artists will draw their characters and then like sign it and you'll pay a fee. Um, and they wouldn't be allowed to do things like that. He gets joined by Todd McFarlane of Spawn and then Eric Larson as well. And Image to this day does not own the rights to its creators' content, so they are allowed to kind of go wherever they would like or self-publish or anything like that. Um, but a lot of people stay with them because they kind of stick to those principles. All right, so some examples of these indie publishers. So Dark Horse published, um, oh gosh, which one? Mask. Um, and this is probably one of its more famous or more significant ones. It's known for its dark humor, really graphic violence, but it distinguishes itself from those mainstream superheroes. Um, Remember that they're a group that will kind of like publish anything, and he's just bizarre. If you've ever seen the movie with Jim Carrey, it's that bizarre, but like incredibly graphic and violent. And this was very in line with their reputation as a home for innovative and unconventional stories. It was originally released in 87 with the in Dark Horse Presents number 10 as Mask, Masque. A couple other comics that you might be familiar with that come from the Dark Horse imprint: Hellboy, which has also had a movie adaptation, Sin City, which I've talked about a couple of times in this presentation, and then the Umbrella Academy, which recently had a TV adaptation through Netflix. Um, Bloodshot was published by Valiant Comics, initially released after a cameo in Eternal Warrior #4. Um, he was a significant, probably their most significant comic and superhero. Is he was a key character known for his grittiness. He had the anti-hero trend, but he also had a really complex backstory that involved nanotechnology. And this kind of launched them and grabbed a lot of people's attention. A few other comics from Valiant, again, definitely not the kind of most famous ones today, but they had Exo Manowar, which was a Visigoth warrior who had a suit of alien armor that made him like more badass. Harbinger was a series that followed superpowered individuals known as Psiots that were led by a telepath, and then Ninjak was a story of a spy master and ninja. Um, I mentioned Image Comics and Spawn a little bit ago. Um, Spawn is their flagship. It was created by Tom McFarlane. It was a huge success and symbolized like this rise of the creator-owned properties. Um, it was sorry. Just like it was unexpected for people, and people couldn't get enough of it, though they had struggle kind of getting it started because the different publishers wouldn't commit to it. And so when Image started and Todd McFarlane joined them, it gave him a platform for that. You guys will probably be familiar with some other imprints of theirs or some other titles of theirs. The Walking Dead by Robert Kirkman is one of theirs. There was a TV show adaptation of that. Zombie Story Invincible, also by Robert Kirkman, which is the teenager who inherits his father's superpowers, and they have the TV show or the cartoon. I believe it's on Amazon. And then Saga is an epic space opera fantasy series that focuses on a family of extraterrestrials by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. And then, not to be outdone, another indie publisher called Mirage Studios brought to life the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It started off as a parody of some popular comics, but became this weird cultural phenomenon. It was originally published um, in like a large format, so it wasn't like very easy to read. It was just like kind of this weird shape. Um, and no one really thought that like a couple or four turtle ninja things would be popular, but they were wrong. Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird started TMNT in 1984. Mirage also published a few kind of manga-esque stories, also about robots and ninjas. All right, a few quick other points. So as the kind of dark age era comes to an end, we start to see a sales decline in and comic book stores start to close because of it. Part of the reason for this is that most of the people who opened comic book stores were comic book fans. They didn't have a lot of business background. And so they didn't actually know how to run businesses effectively. There was also just this kind of flood of content because of all the indie publishers, because of the kind of the great and more famous publishers like Marvel and DC. They're just pumping out title after title after title. And like each superhero would sometimes have like four or five different storylines happening simultaneously. Um, it was really hard for people to predict what was going to be popular. And then there was just so much content to buy. So the comic book stores were buying all of this material. A lot of it wasn't selling. And then they would just have like piles of comics just sitting in corners that they couldn't un or offload. Um, so because it's just so there's just so much content, the sales start to decline for Marvel and DC because now the audience is spreading their readership across these indie platforms as well. So they decide to boot a bunch of the popular franchises. X-Men gets a reboot, Spider-Man gets a reboot, Superman gets a reboot, everybody gets a reboot. Um, but this is not as successful as they would expect. And this is probably for two reasons, in addition to just the lack of the industry's knowledge about how to sell its material now that you have the direct to sale comic book store. But there were very limited titles for younger audiences. So the people who, grew up reading comics in the Silver Age or have aged, right? The people who grew up reading the Bronze Age, they've aged. And while these readers want these more mature titles, they aren't creating anything for younger audiences, which means they're not building any new readers. And so as the Dark Age comes to a close, you start to have a generation of folks that weren't that into comics, at least in the same way that they had been before. Um, and we had all this light being shed on sexism at all levels from in the industry, from the representation of women in the comics, which we've already discussed, to um, if people are willing to portray women in those ways in the pages of comic books, they have to have particular viewpoints to be willing to do that. So it's no surprise then that there was a lot of sexism on the part of the writers in the comic book industry, the artists, the publishers, the CEOs. It was not a strongly safe space for women. And so women left the industry in droves, and then that also led to less women being represented in the stories, and then less women reading. So comics basically became kind of the format or the popular media of men, and more specifically, middle-aged men. And so they lost a significant readership base there. All right, so the end of an era, and I have the question marks here because, again, remember people are divided on this. Not everyone agrees as to what the actual end of the Dark Age is. But Astro City is a comic that signals a shift. Um, in that the storytelling focused less on a dark and edgy narrative and more on just the personal lives of heroes. So that kind of feet of clay thing came back. And Astro City has been called a love letter to the Silver Age. Um, and it demonstrated a kind of a nostalgia of the artists and the writers and the readership too. Um, for a time when heroes were flawed, but not just like awful people. And that tragedy wasn't lurking around every corner. People got tired of watching every one of the characters they cared about die. Um, Also at this time, toward the end of this age, we saw the comic book Kingdom Come. Um, which is a Superman comic that is considered a deconstruction of Dark Age narratives. And what that means is that the comic itself points out all the tropes of the time, all those things that we pointed out at the beginning of the presentation. Um, and like started tearing them apart and like really drawing readers' attention to those things and asking readers to reflect on those trends. Um, and so whenever somebody deconstructs kind of a literary period or artistic period, um, that means enough time has passed for artists and writers to actually notice the trends. So like when you're kind of happening in the middle of it, you don't notice that this is a trend. But after so much of it, you notice like, oh, this, kind of shoving women in refrigerators thing has happened quite a bit. Um, and so once that's noticeable, it usually signals a shift in content and storytelling. Which typically should suggest the end of an era. Um, and then, as I mentioned before, the comic sales start to tank in the late 90s. Comic book stores are unable to house just the astronomical number of titles being produced. Um, and so, because the market was so saturated, but most of it didn't have what creators kind of called artistic quality. So like a lot of it was just like rush jobs, not well written, not well drawn. The stories became really cliche. The art was what we call sensationalistic, like kind of shocking for the sake of being shocking. Think of it kind of like clickbait, um, or catfishing, but in comic book form. Um, and this sort of over-reliance on sales, because of this decline in sales, there also became an over-reliance in spin-off market sales, such as games and toys. Um, uh, Older issues selling for quite a bit, they stopped being collected. So all of these kind of revenue avenues that the different comic book companies had, from the comics themselves to collectors buying them to the toys and the games and the cards and things like that. Um, they're just People just stopped doing it because it was too much. Um, and as a result, Marvel goes bankrupt, and that signals very distinctly kind of a major shift, a major like kind of closing point in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we will talk about Marvel's recovery when we get into the modern age.